23 corpses rest entombed beneath the tobacco crops of Henrico County, Virginia. Their burial places remain unmarked, their vanishings meticulously planned by two siblings who transformed killing into commerce. What started as an apparently harmless bet between brothers during a sweltering September evening in 1851 would uncover a slaughter operation that had functioned undetected for more than 10 years, taking lives from 3 states and producing sufficient blood profits to construct one of the largest tobacco estates in the Commonwealth. The county sheriff's files, locked away for almost 70 years, show that Margaret Carmichael wasn't the initial spouse to disappear from the property, nor would she be the final one to learn the horrifying reality about her husband's family enterprise. Legal papers from Richmond describe how the siblings had mastered their system of attracting wealthy wanderers to their deaths, functioning with such accuracy that not one disappearance had been linked to Riverside Manor until Margaret's probe ended, their rule of horror in its brutal finale. Before we proceed with the tale of the Carmichael estate and the lethal secrets hidden in its earth, please subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. We enjoy hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts throughout America. The fall of 1851 delivered an uncommon coldness to central Virginia, creating conditions for incidents that would permanently taint the standing of one of the area's most distinguished tobacco-growing families and reveal a sequence of deliberate murder that had remained unnoticed for over 12 years. Henrico County extended across undulating hills scattered with plantation homes, their white pillars shining against fields of golden tobacco leaves prepared for collection. The area had thrived during the tobacco expansion of the 1840s, with affluent planters constructing magnificent estates along the James River and creating trade pathways that linked Virginia's farming center to markets in Richmond, Petersburg, and further. The financial system relied on an intricate web of traveling traders, tobacco purchasers, and financial representatives who traveled regularly between plantations, carrying considerable amounts of currency and operating business distant from urban authority oversight. The Carmichael property, recognized locally as Riverside Manor, controlled nearly 2,000 acres alongside the James River, establishing it as one of the biggest tobacco operations between Richmond and Petersburg. The manor structure itself rose 3 floors high, constructed from regional brick and Virginia pine, with surrounding porches that captured the river wind during the scorching summer periods. Enormous oak trees, some exceeding a century old, offered shade for the circular pathway where carriages frequently arrived, transporting visitors from throughout the Commonwealth. The residence featured 12 rooms, including a library filled with leather-bound books, a formal eating area capable of accommodating 16 guests, and 6 bedrooms furnished with items imported from Philadelphia and Baltimore. The plantation's position proved strategically ideal for the brothers' purposes. Located along the primary roadway linking Richmond to Petersburg, it naturally drew travelers seeking overnight lodging. The James River provided transportation for tobacco shipments, while also presenting convenient disposal alternatives for anything the brothers preferred to keep concealed from inquisitive neighbors. Thick forests surrounded 3 sides of the land, guaranteeing privacy for activities that demanded discretion. Brothers Edmund and Clayton Carmichael had received the estate from their father in 1839, along with 47 enslaved laborers and obligations that threatened to eliminate everything their family had constructed over 3 generations. Old Josiah Carmichael had been a respected member of Virginia society, serving 2 periods in the state legislature and maintaining friendships with prominent political figures. Throughout the Commonwealth, his unexpected death from apoplexy in the spring of 1839 left his sons with a plantation that seemed successful but was actually losing money due to poor crop prices and accumulated gambling obligations. Edmund, the older by 2 years, possessed the calculating intellect of a businessman with dark hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to assess everything in terms of potential gain. Standing just above 6 feet tall, he maintained himself with the stiff bearing of a military officer. Though he had never served in any role beyond the local militia, his education at the College of William and Mary had given him the social connections and financial understanding that would prove crucial to the brothers' future enterprises. Edmund's letters with Richmond bankers and Petersburg merchants revealed a man capable of extraordinary charm when situations demanded it, but also possessed a coldness that disturbed even his closest business partners. Clayton maintained himself with the natural charm that made him well-liked among the county's social circles, particularly with the daughters of neighboring planters, who found his sharp wit and attractive features compelling. 2 years younger than Edmund, Clayton stood slightly shorter but with wider shoulders, and the type of contagious smile that could remove suspicion and open doors throughout Virginia society. His reputation as a talented horseman and eager participant in fox hunts had gained him invitations to the finest homes in central Virginia, providing valuable information about wealthy travelers and their planned routes. Together, they had converted a failing plantation into one of Virginia's most profitable tobacco enterprises. Though few neighbors understood precisely how the brothers had managed such a remarkable transformation, the change had begun in 1840 when the brothers started providing hospitality to travelers who appeared to possess substantial financial resources. What had initially appeared like traditional Southern hospitality gradually developed into something far more evil as the brothers discovered how simple it was to make wealthy strangers vanish without drawing unwanted attention from local authorities. The county seat of Richmond sat 30 miles to the east, close enough for regular commerce, but far enough to ensure privacy for the brothers' more sensitive business matters. Sheriff Thomas Garrett, a political appointee more concerned with maintaining social peace than investigating suspicious deaths, had proven remarkably cooperative when the brothers occasionally needed official documentation to support their explanations for various disappearances. The sheriff's willingness to accept their stories without extensive investigation had been bought through a combination of financial donations to his political campaigns and regular invitations to the elaborate dinner parties that made Riverside Manor a center of Henrico County social life. Henrico County in 1851 was experiencing the tensions that would soon divide the nation apart. Debates over slavery's expansion, economic pressures from northern industrial growth, and whispered discussions about states' rights that grew louder with each passing month. These political distractions provided perfect cover for the brothers' activities as local authorities focused their attention on larger regional concerns rather than investigating isolated disappearances that could easily be attributed to the dangers of frontier travel. Margaret Dunmore had arrived at Riverside Manor in June of 1851 as Edmund's bride, having met him during a spring social gathering hosted by the Virginia Agricultural Society. The daughter of a declining tobacco family from Chesterfield County, she brought little dowry but possessed the kind of refined beauty and social connections that could open doors for ambitious men. Her auburn hair and green eyes had caught Edmund's attention immediately, but it was her quick intelligence and ability to navigate complex social situations that convinced him she would be the perfect wife for a man with secrets to protect. Margaret's education had been more extensive than typical for women of her social class, thanks to a progressive aunt who had insisted on hiring private tutors to supplement her formal schooling. She spoke fluent French, had studied botany and natural history, and possessed a keen understanding of financial matters that her father had encouraged, despite social conventions that discouraged such knowledge in women. These skills, intended to make her an accomplished hostess and conversation partner, would ultimately prove essential to her survival and eventual triumph. Over the Carmichael brothers, the wedding had been a grand affair attended by politicians from Richmond and plantation owners from across central Virginia. Governor John Floyd himself had offered a toast to the happy couple, while Richmond's most prominent merchants and bankers celebrated what they believed would be a union that strengthened Virginia's agricultural aristocracy. Margaret had seemed genuinely happy during those first months of marriage, writing letters to her sister in Petersburg about the magnificence of her new home and the kindness of her brother-in-law Clayton, who had welcomed her into the family with enthusiasm that some neighbors found almost excessive. The letters later discovered among Margaret's personal effects revealed her initial impressions of Riverside Manor as a palace compared to our poor farm in Chesterfield, and described elaborate dinner parties where the finest gentlemen in Virginia gathered to discuss politics and business while consuming the most exquisite wines and delicacies. She had been particularly impressed by the brothers' apparent wealth, noting that they seemed to possess resources far beyond what tobacco farming typically provided, even for the most successful planters. But by September, those closest to Margaret began to notice changes in her behavior that suggested all was not well at Riverside Manor. She appeared distracted during social calls, often staring out windows toward the tobacco fields with an expression that her friend Sarah Caldwell would later describe to authorities as deeply troubled, as if she had seen something that haunted her waking hours. Her appetite diminished noticeably, and she began declining invitations to the social gatherings that had once delighted her, citing headaches and fatigue that seemed to have no medical explanation. The enslaved workers at Riverside Manor spoke in hushed tones about their mistress, noting how she had begun taking long walks around the property, sometimes disappearing for hours at a time. Old Moses, who tended the kitchen garden and had served the Carmichael family for over 20 years, would later tell investigators that he had seen Margaret digging near the old tobacco barn on multiple occasions, always alone, and always looking over her shoulder, as if afraid of being discovered. The workers had also noticed her asking unusual questions about the plantation's history, particularly about previous mistresses and guests who had visited in years past. The evening of September 18, 1851, began like many others at Riverside Manor, with the three family members gathering for dinner in the grand dining room beneath a crystal chandelier imported from France during the plantation's more prosperous days. The table was set with the finest china and silver, reflecting the brothers' insistence on maintaining appearances even when conducting their darkest business. Candles flickered in silver holders, casting dancing shadows across portraits of long-dead Carmichael ancestors who gazed down with expressions that seemed to disapprove of their descendants' activities. The meal proceeded normally through the first three courses, with conversation focusing on tobacco prices and political developments in Richmond. Clayton regaled them with gossip from his recent trip to Petersburg, while Edmund discussed his plans for expanding the plantation's operations in the coming year. Margaret participated in the conversation with her usual grace, though careful observers might have noticed a tension in her voice that suggested underlying anxiety about something more serious than social pleasantries. The atmosphere changed dramatically when Clayton, emboldened by several glasses of bourbon and apparently seeking to provoke some reaction from his increasingly distant sister-in-law, proposed what he called a gentleman's wager to his brother. The words hung in the air like smoke from the candles as Margaret set down her fork and stared at Clayton with growing alarm. "I wager," Clayton said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way, "that I can seduce your lovely wife within a fortnight, and she'll be begging me to take her away from this dreary plantation life." He raised his glass toward Margaret with a mock toast that sent bourbon sloshing over the rim. No offense intended, my dear sister-in-law, but Edmund has always been rather predictable in matters of the heart. Perhaps a woman of your obvious intelligence and beauty requires more exciting companionship than my dear brother can provide. The casual cruelty of the proposal struck Margaret like a physical blow. But what disturbed her even more was Edmund's reaction, or rather, his lack of one. Instead of the explosive anger she expected from any decent husband, Edmund leaned back in his chair, studying his brother with the same calculating expression she had seen him use when negotiating tobacco prices with buyers from Richmond. The candlelight flickered across his face, casting shadows that made his features appear almost predatory as he considered the proposal with apparent seriousness. "And what stakes do you propose, brother?" Edmund asked, his voice unnaturally calm for a man whose wife had just been propositioned at his own dinner table. What would make such a wager worth the risk of family harmony and social reputation? Surely you understand that such games require substantial motivation to justify the potential consequences. Clayton's grin widened, revealing teeth stained by years of tobacco use and excessive wine consumption. His eyes gleamed with the anticipation of a man who believed victory was already within his grasp. $500 says I can have her in my bed before October arrives. And if I succeed, you write off that debt I owe you from the Richmond land deal. Another 1,000 if memory serves. But here's the truly interesting part, dear brother. If she proves more resistant than anticipated, we'll know she's discovered something about our family business that requires immediate attention. The words hit Margaret like ice water, as she suddenly understood that this was not merely a crude wager between brothers, but something far more sinister. The casual reference to family business and the meaningful look that passed between Edmund and Clayton suggested depths of conspiracy that she was only beginning to comprehend. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, fighting to maintain composure while her mind raced through the implications of what she had just heard. Edmund's continued calm as he considered the proposal filled Margaret with a terror that went beyond simple humiliation. The man she had married, who had courted her with poetry and promises of a peaceful life among Virginia's rural aristocracy, was revealing himself to be something entirely different. A calculating predator who viewed his own wife as little more than a test subject in some larger, more sinister scheme. "Make it 1,000, Edmund said finally, extending his hand toward his brother with the same businesslike manner he might use to conclude any commercial transaction. "But if you fail, you transfer your share of the North Tobacco fields to my name alone. And Clayton, if she proves problematic in ways that require permanent solutions, we'll split the costs of resolving the situation according to our usual arrangements." The brothers shook hands across the dinner table, while Margaret stared at them in horror, their bourbon glasses clinking together like a death knell. Neither man looked at her directly, as if her feelings on the matter were entirely irrelevant to their agreement. The casual way they discussed her potential murder, for that was clearly what Edmund meant by permanent solutions, revealed a level of callousness that suggested this was not their first such conversation. That night, Margaret lay awake in the four-poster bed she shared with Edmund, listening to him breathe beside her and trying to understand what had just happened. The man she had married seemed like a stranger, capable of wagering away her honor as casually as he might bet on a horse race, and apparently willing to countenance her murder if she became inconvenient. The realization that both brothers viewed her as an object to be won, lost, or disposed of, filled her with a cold fury that would only grow stronger in the days to come. Sleep eluded her as she replayed every conversation, every strange incident, every unexplained absence that had puzzled her during her months at Riverside Manor. The locked rooms that Edmund claimed contained nothing but old furniture, the workers who disappeared without explanation, The guests who arrived with fanfare but seemed to vanish without proper farewells. All of these mysteries took on new and terrifying significance in light of what she had just witnessed. Over the next week, Clayton began his campaign of seduction with the subtlety of a man who had never been refused anything he truly wanted. He appeared at Margaret's side during her morning walks, offering his arm and engaging her in conversations about literature and music that revealed a surprisingly cultured mind beneath his rakish exterior. His knowledge of poetry and philosophy suggested an education that matched her own, while his observations about art and architecture demonstrated travels that extended far beyond Virginia's borders. He brought her small gifts that seemed carefully chosen to appeal to her specific interests. A book of botanical illustrations from Richmond, wildflowers picked from the riverbank and arranged with obvious skill, a silk ribbon that perfectly matched her eyes. Each gesture was accompanied by compliments that grew increasingly bold and personal, delivered with the kind of practiced charm that suggested extensive experience in seducing women, despite their initial resistance. But Margaret was not the naive young woman the brothers believed her to be. Her education and natural intelligence, combined with the growing certainty that her life was in danger, sharpened her powers of observation to an extraordinary degree. She began to pay closer attention to the strange rhythms of life at Riverside Manor, noting how certain rooms remained locked even when the brothers claimed to be conducting routine business, how conversations between Edmund and Clayton ceased abruptly whenever she approached, and how workers sometimes disappeared from the fields without the usual explanations about illness or family emergencies that typically accompanied such absences. Her walks around the property took on new purpose as she searched for answers to questions that grew more disturbing with each passing day. The vast acreage of Riverside Manor provided numerous opportunities for concealment, and Margaret began to suspect that the brothers were hiding far more than extramarital affairs or financial irregularities. The very landscape seemed to hold secrets, from the dense woods that bordered the property to the seemingly innocent outbuildings scattered across the plantation grounds. The first concrete evidence of the brothers' true nature came to Margaret on a rain-soaked afternoon in late September when she discovered a leather-bound ledger hidden behind a loose brick in the library fireplace. She had been examining the room's architecture, searching for possible hiding places where important documents might be concealed, when her fingers found the brick that shifted slightly under pressure behind. It lay a cavity that contained not only the ledger, but also a collection of personal items that clearly belonged to people who were no longer at Riverside Manor. The book contained entries dating back to 1840, written in Edmund's precise handwriting, documenting what appeared to be a series of business transactions unlike anything she had ever seen. Each entry followed the same meticulous format: a name, a date, a location, a physical description, and a sum of money. Thomas Whitaker, September 12, 1842. Richmond Road. Tall, brown hair, gold watch, $200. Samuel Chen, March 3, 1843. Petersburg Pike. Short, black hair, Chinese features, silk merchant. 150. Father Miguel Santos, July 19, 1844. Church Creek. Medium height, Hispanic priest traveling north, $300. The list went on for page after page, containing over 60 names and representing thousands of dollars in mysterious income that far exceeded what any tobacco plantation could generate through legitimate farming operations. Each entry included details that suggested intimate knowledge of the victims, their physical appearance, their possessions, their reasons for traveling, and their estimated wealth. The level of detail implied systematic observation and planning that went far beyond random criminal opportunism. At first, Margaret wondered if the ledger documented some legitimate business dealing, perhaps debt collection, land speculation, or even slave trading, which, while morally reprehensible, would at least explain the secretive nature of the records. But as she studied the entries more carefully, disturbing patterns began to emerge that pointed towards something far more sinister than any conventional business enterprise. Many of the names were followed by notations in a different hand, which she recognized as Clayton's sprawling script that contrasted sharply with Edmund's precise penmanship. These notes contained phrases that chilled her blood. Disposed of according to plan, no complications, or no further inquiries expected from family, or most chilling of all, Richmond authorities satisfied with explanation. Case closed without investigation. The final section of the ledger contained what appeared to be a detailed map of the plantation grounds, drawn with the precision of a military engineer and showing not only the obvious features like the manor house, tobacco fields and river access, but also numerous small X marks scattered across areas that appeared to be unused woodland and fallow fields. 23 marks in total, each accompanied by initials and dates that corresponded exactly to entries in the main ledger. Margaret counted the marks twice, her hands trembling as the horrible truth began to crystallize in her mind. This was not a record of business transactions. It was a murder log, documenting more than a decade of systematic killing that had transformed Riverside Manor into a charnel house disguised as a respectable plantation. The X marks represented graves, and the carefully recorded sums represented the blood money stolen from victims who had made the fatal mistake of accepting the Carmichael brothers' hospitality, the personal items hidden, with the ledger provided additional evidence of the brothers' crimes. A woman's wedding ring engraved with initials that did not match any current residents of the plantation, a gold pocket watch bearing the name of a Philadelphia merchant, a silver crucifix that had obviously belonged to a Catholic priest, and a collection of coins from various states that suggested victims had come from across the region to meet their deaths at Riverside Manor. Her investigation took on new urgency as she began to piece together the brothers' method with the thoroughness of a trained detective. The Carmichael plantation sat along a major thoroughfare between Richmond and Petersburg, making it a natural stopping point for travelers who needed overnight accommodation or simply wished to rest their horses during long journeys. The brothers had transformed their home into an elaborate trap, offering hospitality to well-dressed strangers carrying substantial amounts of cash, then murdering them for their money and belongings before disposing of the bodies in unmarked graves scattered across their vast property. The victims were chosen with careful attention to risk management. People traveling alone, without local connections, whose disappearances would not immediately attract attention from law enforcement agencies that were already stretched thin across Virginia's rural counties. Merchants conducting business between cities, wealthy planters traveling to markets or social events, clergymen moving between parishes, and immigrants carrying their life savings in search of new opportunities, all made perfect targets for the brothers' enterprise. Margaret's walks around the property now focused on the areas marked in the ledger's map, and what she discovered there confirmed her worst fears about the true nature of Riverside Manor. Near the old tobacco barn, she found patches of ground where the earth seemed softer than the surrounding soil, as if it had been disturbed and replanted within recent years. The vegetation in these areas grew differently as well, with an unusual lushness that suggested fertilization by decomposing organic matter. By the creek that bordered the eastern edge of the property, she discovered fragments of clothing and personal effects that had been carelessly buried or washed up during spring floods that periodically changed the creek's course. A brass button here, a piece of torn fabric there, a broken chain that had once held a pocket watch, small remnants of lives that had been snuffed out for profit and convenience. The most disturbing Discovery came when she found what appeared to be a partially collapsed root cellar hidden among the trees near the property's northern boundary. The structure had obviously been modified from its original purpose as food storage, with new drainage that led toward the creek and evidence of recent use that included tools for digging and chemicals that could accelerate decomposition. The smell that emanated from the cellar on warm days confirmed Margaret's suspicions about its current function in the brothers' operation. The realization that she was living among killers filled Margaret with a terror that she struggled to hide from her husband and brother-in-law during their daily interactions. But alongside the fear came a burning desire for justice and a growing understanding that she herself was in mortal danger. The wager between the brothers was not the innocent game of seduction she had initially believed. It was a test to determine whether she had discovered their secret and how best to silence her permanently. As October approached, Clayton's attempts at seduction became more aggressive and desperate, suggesting that he was under pressure to produce results within the time frame established by their wager. He cornered her in empty rooms with increasing frequency, pressing his attentions with a boldness that bordered on assault. But Margaret now understood that his interest in her was not romantic. He was trying to gauge how much she knew about the family business and whether she posed a threat that required elimination. Every conversation became a delicate dance of deception as she tried to appear naive and unsuspecting while secretly gathering more evidence of the brothers' crimes. She learned to school her expressions and control her reactions. Even when Clayton made comments that revealed his knowledge of events that should have been unknown to anyone except the victims and their killers, the breaking point came on the evening of September 30th when Margaret overheard a conversation between Edmund and Clayton in the library that removed any remaining doubt about the brothers' intentions toward both herself and their next victim. Hidden behind the partially open door, she listened as they discussed their plans with the casual efficiency of men who had repeated this process dozens of times over the course of more than a decade. The tobacco buyer from North Carolina sent word that he'll arrive next week with the full payment, Edmund said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a businessman discussing a profitable transaction. William Henley is his name, apparently quite successful in the Piedmont region. His letter indicates he'll be traveling with at least $3,000 in cash, possibly more if he's planning to make additional purchases on his return journey. Clayton's laugh held genuine amusement as he contemplated their next victim. 3,000 would be our largest single take this year, more than enough to finance the expansion of the North Fields and still leave us with substantial reserves for winter expenses. Has he confirmed his arrival date? October 7th, Edmund replied. He plans to inspect the tobacco on the 8th and complete the transaction the following day. That gives us 3 days to plan the details, though our usual approach should suffice for a lone traveler carrying that amount of cash. I've already confirmed with Sheriff Garrett that he'll be visiting family in Richmond that week, so we won't need to worry about unexpected official visits during the crucial period. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, fighting back nausea as she listened to the brothers plan another murder with the same attention to detail they might bring to planning a dinner party. The casual reference to Sheriff Garrett's convenient absence confirmed her suspicions that local law enforcement was either complicit in the brothers' crimes or deliberately avoiding situations that might require them to investigate too closely. This one should bring us enough to expand the North Field substantially, Edmund continued. Clayton, you'll handle the usual arrangements after dinner on the 8th. I assume we can count on your expertise with the nightcap preparation. We can't afford any mistakes with such a valuable guest. Of course, Clayton replied with the confidence of long practice, though we should consider Margaret's situation soon. She's been asking too many questions about the locked rooms, and I noticed her near the old burial sites yesterday afternoon. Moses mentioned that she's been digging around the tobacco barn, apparently looking for something specific. The seduction approach isn't working as effectively as we anticipated. She's more intelligent than most women, and her education makes her naturally curious about things that don't concern her. Edmund's laugh held no warmth as he contemplated his wife's fate with the same cold calculation he applied to all his business decisions. Then we'll have to accelerate our timeline concerning dear Margaret. After we deal with the tobacco buyer, we'll arrange a suitable accident for our troublesome wife. Perhaps a fall from her horse during one of her beloved walks, or a tragic drowning in the river during an evening stroll. Accidents happen so frequently to curious wives who involve themselves in matters beyond their understanding. The brothers discussed various methods for eliminating Margaret with the same professional detachment they brought to planning their other murders, evaluating the relative merits of different approaches based on factors like credibility, timing, and the likelihood of attracting unwanted attention from Margaret's family in Chesterfield County. They had clearly given considerable thought to the problem she represented and had reached the conclusion that her death was not only inevitable but necessary for the continued success of their operation. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, fighting back the urge to vomit as she listened to the brothers plan her murder with the same casual efficiency they brought to their other victims. She had hoped against hope that Edmund retained some genuine affection for her, but now she understood that she was simply another obstacle to be removed when convenient. The man who had courted her with poetry and promises of happiness had never existed. He was simply a mask worn by a calculating killer who viewed human life as nothing more than a commodity to be exploited for profit. The conversation continued with discussion of practical details that revealed the brothers' extensive experience in making people disappear without attracting unwanted attention. They had clearly refined their methods over the years, learning from mistakes and developing procedures that minimized risk while maximizing profit. Their success had made them confident to the point of arrogance, apparently believing that their wealth and social connections made them untouchable by local authorities who depended on their political support and financial contributions. But as Margaret listened to them plan her death, she realized that their confidence might also be their weakness. The brothers had grown so accustomed to success that they had become careless in certain ways, assuming that their victims would remain passive and accept their fate without resistance. They had not anticipated that Margaret's education and intelligence would enable her to uncover their secrets, nor had they considered the possibility that a woman might be capable of fighting back with methods as ruthless as their own. That night, Margaret made a decision that would change everything and set in motion events that would bring the brothers' reign of terror to a bloody conclusion. She could not flee. Edmund controlled all their finances, and a woman traveling alone in 1851 would attract exactly the kind of attention she needed to avoid while also being vulnerable to the same predators who had claimed so many other victims. She could not seek help from local authorities. The brothers' wealth and political connections in Henrico County ran too deep for her accusations to be believed without substantial proof, and Sheriff Garrett's complicity meant that approaching law enforcement would likely result in her immediate elimination. Her only option was to turn the brothers' own methods against them, using their confidence and assumptions about feminine helplessness to catch them off guard. If she was going to die at Riverside Manor, she would not go quietly, and she would ensure that justice was served, even if she did not survive to see it. Margaret began her preparation by studying the local flora during her walks, with the systematic approach of a natural scientist, focusing on plants that grew wild around the plantation and could serve her deadly purpose. Her education had included extensive botanical knowledge that she now applied toward understanding which native species contained toxins powerful enough to kill grown men. Virginia's woods and fields contained several species of highly toxic plants, including water hemlock, which grew abundantly near the creek, deadly nightshade, which flourished in the shaded areas beneath the old oak trees, and pokeweed, whose roots contained concentrated poisons that could be extracted through careful preparation. Water hemlock, she learned from her botanical texts, was considered one of the most poisonous plants in North America, containing cytotoxin that attacked the nervous system and caused death through respiratory failure. The plant's roots contained the highest concentration of poison, and the toxin could be extracted through a process of grinding and boiling that would create a colorless, nearly odorless liquid that could be easily added to food or drink without detection. She also began to document everything she had learned about the brothers' crimes, writing detailed accounts in a journal that she hid beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. Her writings described the exact location of each burial site marked on Edmund's map, copied entries from the murder ledger with precise attention to dates and victim descriptions, and detailed the patterns she had observed in the brothers' victim selection and disposal methods. The journal also contained her own observations about the brothers' personalities and habits, information that could prove valuable to any future investigation. Edmund's methodical nature and obsession with record-keeping, Clayton's impulsiveness and tendency toward overconfidence, their established routines, and the security measures they employed to protect their secrets. All of these details were carefully recorded in case Margaret did not survive to testify about what she had discovered. If something happened to her, she wanted evidence to remain that might eventually bring the brothers to justice and provide closure for the families of their victims. Her writings included recommendations for where investigators should search for additional evidence, which local officials might be complicit in covering up the brothers' crimes, and how the murder enterprise had evolved over the years to become more sophisticated and profitable. Meanwhile, Clayton's frustration with his failing seduction grew more apparent each day, creating an atmosphere of increasing tension that made Margaret's position even more precarious. The October deadline for their wager was approaching rapidly, and Margaret's continued resistance was costing him both money and pride, while also raising questions about whether she might have discovered something that made her immune to his usual charm. Offensive, his attempts to corner her alone became more frequent and aggressive, requiring increasingly creative evasion on Margaret's part. She learned to vary her routines and never venture into isolated areas of the house or grounds without ensuring that enslaved workers or other witnesses were nearby. Clayton's behavior during these encounters revealed a man whose patience was rapidly approaching its breaking point, suggesting that the brothers might decide to abandon their original timeline and move against her sooner than planned. The arrival of Dr. William Henley from North Carolina provided Margaret with the opportunity she needed to implement her plan, while also potentially saving an innocent life. Henley arrived at Riverside Manor on October 7, 1851, driving a fine carriage pulled by matching bay horses and carrying himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to substantial wealth and social respect. He was exactly the type of victim the brothers preferred. Traveling alone, carrying a large sum of cash for his tobacco purchase, and with no local connections to immediately notice his disappearance if he failed to return home as scheduled.